Begum Shekhawat Hussain, who writes Sultana's Dream. And it's a fantasy about a world where women run when women run the affairs and men live secluded lives. This is being written in the 19th century. So you have these new writings emerging in the 19th century, and women are coming out and expressing themselves, expressing their agency.
So, on this topic of literature and culture, we have reached to a point where we are now going to talk about the modern India or the colonial period. Let's know more in our today's episode of Art and Culture with Devdutt Pattanaik. Hello everyone, I am Manas Srivastava and you are watching UPSC Essentials of the Indian Express, where like always we are in conversation with Devdutt Pattanaik. Devdutt talks about art and culture and those relevant topics which are important for your exams but also life in general. So in the previous episodes you've seen that we've covered literature and culture, and we have talked about ancient India, the medieval India, and today we are going to talk about modern India or the colonial times. So, Devdutt, let's begin with a very general yet very important question, that how this modern Indian literature developed in India.
And really, this is the result of the arrival of colonial powers into India, that is, European powers. So the Portuguese came to India in the 16th century, followed by the Dutch, and then the French and the English. They all came to India in the 17th century, 18th century. And with them came new technologies. The technology which came with them was the printing press. Remember, the printing press was invented in China about 2000 years ago, but about 500 years ago, in the 15th century, it reaches Europe, and the Europeans really use the printing press to print the Bible, and the Bible gets accessible to everybody in Europe, and that creates a huge social revolution in Europe. And then the printing press in the 16th century, just barely 100 years after that, comes to India on its way to Africa, but remains in Goa for some reason. And this is when the Bible starts being printed in India, and really by missionaries. To promote missionary work in the 17th century, you find this in Goa, you find Bible being translated into Konkani. It's called the Krista Puran in Konkani. And basically printing was used to missionary work by the Portuguese people in the 16th century. But when the British come, they do something different. They realize that they want clerks, they want babus, and therefore they want to start schools in India. And therefore the printing press is used to reproduce science textbooks in India. So technical books, science books start appearing in India, and they're printed in Calcutta, in Allahabad, in Lucknow in the 19th century. So suddenly the printing press and the technology of the printing press and the shift in focus from religion and conversion to science and language and mathematics to create clerks by the British is what really propels the modern literary movement in India. Remember, the printing press was not allowed to enter the Ottoman Empire. One of the reasons why the Islamic world fell back in the world of modernity. So from Europe it came to India, but it bypassed the Muslim world, the Ottoman world, Egypt, Persia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, all these places where the Ottoman empires, Safavid empires existed. They did not like the printing press because they thought the calligraphers would lose their jobs. And because of that, knowledge remained limited, because when you write it down in calligraphy, it's only available for the elite. But when the printing technology comes to India, one, the technology, two, the content moves from religious to scientific, secular, mathematical writings. Purpose is different, not to convert people, but to create clerks. Something shifts in society. Now people are educated. Men are educated, women are educated, upper class men are educated, lower class men are educated, different castes are educated, and that creates a revolution. That's how modern literature began in India. So you have to understand these structural changes that happened with the new rulers of India, bringing new technology, bringing new content, bringing new subjects into India. And that changes the mindset. Of course, we always talk about Macaulay in 1835, his minutes about how he wanted Indians to look like Indians but think like Europeans, to serve as clerks. And we can get very angry with this, but really this sort of sparked a revolution in Indian thought, because we got access to new ways of thinking, new knowledge, new skills, maths, science, literature, new ways of looking at the world, new philosophies like humanism, equality, egalitarianism. New ideas came into India in the schools and colleges. People were talking about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, equality, the end of monarchies, the rise of democracies. All this shaped modern literature.
So, in this answer of Devdutt, we get to know about the causes, the impact, the significance. So, all three aspects of what is expected in an answer in in one go, in one package. So that way it is very important. And also remember that, when we're talking about how the literature developed, modern literature, we're talking about technology, we're also talking about the content of the text, we're also talking about the British rule. And now, speaking about the British rule, if Devdutt, you can elaborate for our students that how this modern Indian literature played such an important, significant role in the independence struggle.
So, how did literature play a role in the India's freedom struggle? Right, the British sort of introduced education into India. It was a shift in policy from what the Portuguese were doing. They were interested in printing press for missionary activities, but the British brought the printing press and education into India and schools, and in order to create clerks. Now, as time progressed, more and more clerks came into a lot of education happened. Lots of people were being educated, and they were being exposed not only to maths and science, but also to new ideas that were emerging in the West. And you have a gentleman like Surendranath Banerjee, who was an ICS, Indian civil servant. But you find him in trouble. Like, he is, at first he's not given admission into the civil service on grounds of his age, and then he's kicked out considering that he's not good enough. Basically for racial grounds, he's kicked out of the civil service. He gets very angry, and he realizes that he'll always be a second class person. Although British talk about equality, really Indians will be second. And he starts talking about nationalism, and the idea of nationhood starts to emerge amongst these educated people that the British created for clerks. And that's how the literary mission starts, when people start writing and they start producing newspapers. So you have Bengali newspapers and Marathi newspapers, like Tilak starts Kesari in Maharashtra. You have newspapers appearing in Bengal. You have English papers appearing, newspapers, knowledge being spread, people having opinions about social matters, and gradually the idea of nationalism becomes important. You have Tagore writing about nationalism. You have Dadasaheb Naoroji writing about the drain of wealth theory. You have you see the knowledge which came into India with the new British rule, the literature which came into India, the education system which came into India was primarily meant to create clerks, but it had two major impacts. One was a social impact. People said that everybody should be educated, upper class, lower class, upper caste, lower caste, across religions. Women should be educated. So there was a social movement that was happening, but at the same time, a political movement also emerged. People started realizing about racism, how they would always be treated as second-class citizens by the rulers of the land. The idea of nationhood emerged. The idea of democracy, liberation, equality emerged. These ideas of justice emerged. Many of the Indians were trained as lawyers. They studied the law, and then they challenged the racial presumptions of the law. And this is how the independence movement started. You have one group of what is called the social reformers who spoke about nationalism, but you also have traditionalists who spoke about nationalism. So if Raja Ram Mohan Roy was a social reformer who spoke about Hinduism in the early part of the 18th century, by the latter part of early part of the 19th century, in the latter part of the 19th century, you have Chandranath Basu talking about traditionalism and using the word Hindutva for the first time, which Savarkar uses later in the early 20th century. So you have even at the early stage, as political movement emerged, the polarization between those who say the new India should have reformist ideas, social upliftment, and the traditionalists who believe that India should go back to the old ways of Varnashrama Dharma, which was perfect in its way, and women's education was not necessary. We forget that Tilak was against women's education. He believed in Swarajya, he believed in self-rule, so you have these new ideas emerging, and that's how the literature, the Kesari newspaper emerges, which talks about nationalism at one level, but it also says that women should not be educated, and it favors caste and says about how Brahmins should get certain benefits and non-Brahmins shouldn't. So you have the Tilak's writings on this, but you have this counter movements by Ranades and Gokhales who say that no, India should progress, India should transform, new ideas should come in, we should talk about liberalism. So all this is happening in the 19th century, which shapes the national movement in India.
Thank you, Devdutt. I think this is a very important question which is answered not only because of its content but also its relevance in the examination. Because there's one thing that a question can be directly asked on literature, then you have to definitely write about literature's role in modern Indian period or independence struggle. But also when a question comes on the freedom movement or independence struggle, even then you have to have at least one paragraph on the role of literature and printing press. So things can be directly asked and used, or it have to be indirectly, mentioned as the fodder of your answer. So that way, these things have to be kept in mind, and make sure that you make them a part of your notes and then final answers in your examination. Now, having said that, let's move on to the next question. And the next question is related to women writing literature. So, Devdutt, if you can throw light on what and how and who among women wrote in Indian literature in the modern period.
So women's writing in India. Now this becomes interesting. It's not that women did not write before the British came to India. There is a lot of women's writings in India before in ancient times. For example, you have Andal writing bhakti poetry, you have Mirabai writing bhakti poetry. You have a courtesan called Muddapalni writing Radhika Santvanam in rather erotic work in the 17th century, and this is printed by another courtesan called Bangalore Ratnamma in the 19th century, which creates a huge outrage in India. But you have these women's writings happening before. There is Ramayan, Chandraba's Ramayan written by women. There are women bhakti poets like Muktabai, Janabai. So women were writing before, but a new form of writing emerges in colonial times as education reaches India, and education at first is available only to elite women. So the zamidars, the rich men, they have these governesses educating women in their houses. The kings are allowing governesses to teach writing and reading to the women of the palace. So it's a class thing. But missionaries, meanwhile, are also spreading education in the lower castes and lower classes. And you have Savitribai Phule, Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra talking about how everybody should be educated, not just the elite classes, not the traditionally educated people, not just the Brahmins and the Kayas, but everyone should be educated. So women should be educated. And so suddenly women's education is becoming important at a social level. So it's not just upper class women, but also lower class women. In the 18th century, women start reading novels. And when novels is, Jane Austen's novels, these novels start reaching India, and these educated women start reading these books, and their mind starts to get new ideas. They start talking about gender equality, opportunities, age of consent. When should you marry? Do you have a right to say, no to your husband? These ideas start emerging in India, and you have women writing novels. This creates changes the way India functions, because women start having opinions. So you have one of the earliest Indian women poet is a lady called so you have Toru Dutt, the India's first poetess who writes in English. Then Rasundra Devi writes Amar Jeevan, her autobiography, where she talks about how she has 12 children, and when she has free time from doing household chores, she educates herself. And therefore, this idea of aspirational women who follow their traditional roles, they're mothers, they take care of the house, but they also want to educate themselves. So you have Rasundari Devi writing Amar Jeevan in Bengali, writing about her biography. So suddenly women are expressing themselves. You have Begum Shekhawat Hussain, who writes Sultana's Dream. And it's a fantasy about a world where women run when women run the affairs and men live secluded lives. This is being written in the 19th century. So you have these new writings emerging in the 19th century, and women are coming out and expressing themselves, expressing their agency, and new ideas emerging. There are women who are educating as doctors. You have cases they're becoming lawyers. These ideas are emerging, and that starts happening in the 19th century because of education.
So a lot of things get cleared, crystal cleared by that answer of Devdutt. So women's writing during the modern India period is not just limited to understand the empowerment of women, but also from the perspective of what it's contributing. So in terms of new ideas, helping us to understand society, history, culture, and so on. And definitely remember the names, which are very important for your answers in your mains or as fodder for your prelims, the questions which are framed around them. Now let's move on to the last question. And today's last question is, Devdutt, I want to talk about literature as source. So we have seen such all wonderful things about literature, understanding literature, how should we go about it, what is the content, but at the same time these literature have some caveats, they have some limitations. So why is it important to understand those limitations? What are those limitations, if you can tell our students?
So, literature is a very important source of understanding culture and history, but we have to be a little careful because remember, when I'm writing something, I use my imagination. And I can write anything I want, and therefore biases come in, bigotry comes in. So, for example, most of the Vedic literature, the Shastra literature, is written by Brahmins and Brahmin men, and therefore they give themselves a privileged position that Brahmins are the most important people, men are important than women. So, we must always ask the question: who is writing this, and when are they writing it, and where are they writing it? Who is writing? When is he writing? Where is he writing? And for what benefit is he writing? So therefore, when you read a piece of literature, if you ask these questions, you understand a lot about that culture. It's also important, like if a man is writing, he'll write differently. When a woman is writing differently. If Greeks are writing about India, it's going to be very different than Indians writing about India. When Chinese write about India, they bring their own biases into the picture. When Buddhists write about India, they bring a different view. The Brahmins write a different view. When a Dalit writes about India, he writes a very different view. When you read a Brahmin document which says that Buddha and the Tirthankara Rishabha are avatars of Vishnu, you don't take them literally. You understand that there is a politics going on, an appropriation is going on, there is a conflict happening. When you hear stories of Shankara Digavijaya, for example, written in the 15th century, you have got this Sanskrit work which talks about how Shankaracharya defeats Buddhist scholars. You have to counter it with Taranath's writing in the 16th century, a Buddhist scholar who talks about how Shankaracharya is defeated by Buddhists. Now, which is true? Which is true? Did Shankaracharya defeat the Buddhists as per the Brahmin documents? But the Buddhist documents say that Shankaracharya was defeated by the Buddhists. So now you have two pieces of literature. Which one do you trust? And that's important. Keralol Patti is a work written in the 17th century which tells the history of Kerala in a very organized way. And it says how Parshuram brought Brahmins to Kerala and civilized the land. Now, is it history or is it just fantasy? Or is it a way of justifying Brahmin control of lands in Kerala? So literature has to be read very carefully. Who is writing the story? When is he writing? Where is he writing? For what is he writing? And we must corroborate written sources with other information, epigraphic evidence, architecture, art, material evidence is very, very important. For example, the Vedic literature is oral traditions, but we don't have much material evidence about it. So when they are talking about it, the only information we have is that in the Gangetic Plain, these poetries are being written. But if they talk about palaces, but we don't get any evidence of a palace as per archaeology, then did palaces exist really, or in the imagination of these poets? So when you study literature, it's important. They give you a window to the past, a window to our culture, how human beings not just created the world, but also how they imagined the world. But we have to always corroborate this information from texts by other subjects, like, as I said, archaeology, art history. Now DNA studies are telling us some things, we have to study that. So lots of things have to be corroborated to make sense of what is written.
Thank you, Devdutt, for mentioning that corroboration of sources, um, which is very important. And students should know that even in history, when we study history, we have so many sources, and their corroboration becomes so important. At the same time, when you were talking about how to ask literature questions, okay, so I'm reminded of this 5W1H approach in journalism. And so I ask a lot of students to follow this 5W1H approach while studying current affairs also. So 5Ws: what, when, where, uh, who, and then there is, of course, how. So this makes understanding of current affairs quite systematic and simple. Now, I believe we've covered almost every aspect of literature and culture in these past 3-4 episodes. Students can write to us. They can mail me on manas.srivastav@indianexpress.com, or you can comment in the comment section of the YouTube. Uh, Please subscribe the Indian Express channel or the page of the YouTube, and uh, do connect with me on the live session at 8 p.m. every Thursday. That's all for today. Thank you, Devdutt, for enlightening our students on this vast topic. And always remember, think smart, work hard, conquer your goal. Bye bye. Manas Srivastava signing off.